We started last time with the 5 Megillot. The 5 Megillot. I'm going to keep writing them down so that we can see them like that. The 5 Megillot. And last time what we looked at was the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon, and the book of Ruth. Today I want to look at the next three in that particular little group. And the first one I want to look at is the book called Esther. Esther. Now, Esther is obviously written during the period of the Persians, or at least even possibly after the period of the Persians. Because what it's about is about this young Jewish girl who marries the king of Persia, Artaxerxes, and gets married to him, becomes part of his harem, part of his group of wives. And it's out of that a plot to destroy the Jews comes about. It's that plot by Haman that now wants to get rid of all the Jews. And of course, they find out about the plot through Esther's uncle called Mordecai, and we know the story that happens from that. If you don't know the story, it's a really good one to read. The interesting part about Esther is that it never mentions God. Never mentions God. And a lot of people kind of wonder about that. How is it that we can have a book of the Tanakh actually not even mentioning God at all? Now, I want to remind you that the Ketuvim, the writings, are the furniture inside the house. Now, when you're looking at the furniture inside the house, you don't think about the walls. You don't need to think about the walls. The walls are taken for granted. And that's the same thing with the book of Esther. It doesn't need to talk about God, because all the people who knew the book of Esther and who understood the book of Esther understood that they were living inside the walls of faith. And that's why the book of Esther is such an important one for them. In fact, there's a whole feast that connects to Esther. It's the feast called Purim. Purim. And it's this festival that reminds them of God's saving power. That in fact God had moved the process ahead of them to be able to put Esther into that position of authority. A position which in some ways is a little bit different for us to think about. Is that how did this Jewish girl end up being married to a Gentile king? And in fact, not just how did she do it, but why was it even encouraged for that to happen? And yet there's a sense in which almost she was put into that position in order to be able to become the savior for her people. And so there's almost this sense of God's preparation, this sense of God's preparing her and her position in order that she could help her people and in order that she could be the savior for her people in that process. And I think that concept of being saved by God, of God having a plan and a purpose and a connection for his people, is what comes so strongly both within Purim and within Esther itself. Is that Esther is a story of God's provision, even though God's not mentioned. Because what for the Jews was important was that everything that they did, all of their life, all of the way in which they lived was within inside the walls of faith, within inside the walls of their relationship with God. So again, when you read Esther, read it with that in mind. Read it with a sense of God's provision, of God's perspective, of God actually working for his people and connecting with them. So that's the book of Esther. The next one is called Lamentations. Sometimes it's called the Lamentations of Jeremiah, because some people believe that Jeremiah wrote it. Other people believe that maybe it was his scribe Baruch. Again, we are not sure who wrote some of these, even though they may be ascribed to some. What we need to see, though, is that there's no question that the person who wrote the book of Lamentations was present during the destruction of Israel, or at least the destruction of Judah, both the city walls and the temple. And so, in a sense, he's almost sitting in the midst of the ruins of his city. He's sitting in the ruins of his hopes, his dreams, his perspective on God. He's sitting in the ruins of all these things, and what does he do? He pours out his lament. He pours out his pain and his grief and his unhappiness and his disappointment with God. It really is a very grief-stricken book. It's a book that really is filled with the tears that come from broken expectations and dreams. And so you can see that potentially was written in 586, when Babylon had come and destroyed Judah and taken the people into exile. That these were the people who left behind and now looked around and saw that God wasn't with them anymore. And it's a wonderful book because, our society has actually stopped us from crying. In our society now, we're told not to cry. We're told not to be upset. But in fact, the book of Lamentations gives us the opportunity to cry. It says, no, we need to cry. We need to express our grief, because it's in the expression of our grief that we maybe begin to find our hope and our sense of God's perspective. Now, Lamentations is a very interesting book because it's 5 chapters, and each chapter is written in the form of an acrostic poem. Now, an acrostic poem means that each stanza begins with the next letter of the alphabet. The next letter of the alphabet. The Hebrew alphabet has 21 letters, and so there's 21 stanzas. And what you see is that each one begins with that next letter. Now, why did they do that? Well, obviously the reason for doing it is so that people would remember it. It's a memory aid. So the book of Lamentations was meant to be read regularly. It was meant to be remembered and reminded of. Why? Well, because Judaism never shirked or hid away from the fact of suffering. They never said that suffering wouldn't happen. In fact, they realized that suffering was going to be part of life. It was going to be part of being the chosen people. Yes, they would never like it. They would never want it. But they knew they had to learn to live with it. And so Lamentations is a process of that. The 3rd chapter, though, the middle chapter, and the middle verse of the middle chapter shows the ray of light shining through into the darkness. It says, great is your faithfulness. Your faithfulness is new every morning. Now, that's a hard word to say if you read the rest of the chapters. And yet that was the process of Lamentations, the opportunity to mourn, to grieve. And so, in fact, there's a whole festival that deals with that. It's called the 9th of Av. The 9th of Av. Av is the name of one of the months, and it's the 9th day of the month of Av. And even today, throughout the world, Jews will remember all the different things that have happened to the Jews over their history. They'll remember the destruction of the first temple. They'll remember the destruction of the second temple. They'll remember the destruction, or at least the revolt by Bar Kokhba later on in 137. And it will remember all those things that have happened to the Jews when they have been under attack and when they have suffered. And what they do is that in the midst of that suffering, they then read Lamentations to share their grief and their connection. The 3rd and last book is the book Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes. Now, the name Ecclesiastes, of course, comes from the Septuagint, from the Greek version of the Tanakh, which talks about the ecclesia. Ecclesia, and then Ecclesiastes comes out of that, which is the gathering. And what happens is that the book of Ecclesiastes is really like a gathering of the church, and then a preacher gets up to talk. And that preacher, sometimes we can call him, or at least he's known as Qoheleth, the Qoheleth, or the preacher. And he preaches, and it's a very strange book. It's a book which it's got some really interesting things in it. And yet a lot of them have become part of English literature. So the sun will shine tomorrow. The things of, there is a time to sow and a time to reap, a time to live and a time to die. Those things all come from the book of Ecclesiastes. One of the big sayings, though, is that all is vanity. All is vanity. And so what was Qoheleth wanting to say? He really was saying, well, what is it that life's about? What is life for? How do we understand life? How do we connect with life? What is life about? And the interesting part is that this particular book is read at another festival called Sukkot. Sukkot. And Sukkot is the day of tabernacles, or the Feast of Tabernacles. It's the feast when, it's the harvest feast. It's the autumn feast. That when people come and bring in all their harvests, and they go and they live outside, and they connect with the wanderings in the desert. It's that concept that happens. And you can imagine that when the Israelites were wandering in the desert for 40 years, you can imagine that they were asking themselves, what is it all about? What's life about? What's life for? And the interesting thing with Koheleth is that he really thinks in the end, well, everything is just meaningless. Life is meaningless. There's no meaning to life. And yet, in chapter 12 of Ecclesiastes, it says, there is nothing good under the sun. Nothing good under the sun. And so the Midrash, the interpretation, the Jewish interpretation of Ecclesiastes says, even though there's nothing good under the sun, what does that mean? Well, it means that we need to be living our life over the sun, or beyond the sun. Effectively, we need to be living our life in terms of who God is. We need to be living our life for God, because only when we live our life for God does life begin to have any meaning.